Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'm reviewing The Men Who Would Be King, which is about the rise and fall of the movie studio known as Dreamworks SKG. I'll talk very briefly about the author. Unfortunately, I don't have a cover to share with you because I did read this on ebook, but I will talk about what I liked about the book, what I didn't like about the book, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I loved reading for next time. Nicole LaPorte is the author of this book, and she has been a journalist in the Hollywood sphere for a long time. She's written for MSN as well as the New York Times. She also learned today that she wrote a book about the college admissions scandal that happened a couple years ago that I'll have to circle back to because that's something that really interests me. So she's known for that. I think she's still primarily known for writing this book. This book came out in roughly 2010. It is a very long book, and I'll try to shorten this video. I could go on and on about this book because I found it really interesting. But what the book is essentially the rise and fall of the Dreamworks. Really was primarily a movie and animation studio founded by David Geffen, Steven Spielberg, Jeffrey Katzenberg, and David Geffen, which is where you get the SKG, which is the initials of their last names, in the early to mid 90s. Each of them are Spielberg and Katzenberg especially are coming off a string of hits where Katzenberg's coming off what was essentially the Disney Renaissance, where he was the leading driver from the Suits perspective of those 3 or 4 movies that he put into production. And Steven Spielberg is coming off of Schindler's List as well as Jurassic Park, so he is pretty much at his commercial and critical heights. For the first time in his career, he was getting nominated for Oscars. And so both of them were coming in very, very hot. And I think there was a general mood in Hollywood at the time to try to find ways for ownership to be the main driver of things. Spielberg especially, it sounded like, wanted to get more into the mode of owning his own properties. Katzenberg wanted that as well, and David Geffen is just kind of a power player in Hollywood. He kind of put the whole thing together and was, I think, more of the deal guy or more the money man who came in and was able to get funding from Paul Allen primarily, who put up something like between $700 and $800 million of his own money throughout the course of the history of the company. So it started in the early 90s and was sold to Paramount in roughly 2008, 2009. And it's really the history of the company and basically going behind the scenes of all the movies that were made, the decisions that were made, the difficulties in all kinds of different areas. And it just is that history. It's a fairly long book, and there's some things I didn't care for in the book, but that's basically what the book is. And so the things that I like the most about it, anytime they kind of get into cultural clashes between these three men and the conflicts of interest, which are rampant throughout the book, I thought that was when it was the most interesting. And I think in the beginning, like a lot of startup companies, they are promising the moon, and we're going to do all these things, and we're going to be innovative, and we're going to change the world, and we're going to do all these things. And the story of the Dreamworks SKG is basically over time, it went from that ideal to becoming basically another studio. And so seeing how they, in the beginning, wanted to have, Spielberg wanted to have basically an artist colony where he would be able to, as the supreme director, come down and watch other directors make their movies and give his notes on things and help them, especially first-time directors. That I think was the vision. They had kind of claimed the space near Los Angeles Airport, LAX, and through environmental reasons were basically ultimately denied that land. So that dream kind of died of them having like a cutting-edge movie studio of their own to rival kind of the entrenched powers in Hollywood, as it were. That kind of died, and once that kind of died, a lot of the sparkle came off. But they had also wanted to get into video games and wanted to get into merchandising and their own attractions and kind of all these things that they, while being a movie studio, while being an animation studio, while being a TV studio. So they were very, very ambitious of what they could do. And I think there was certainly an amount of hubris, and I think a lot of people in the town, regardless of their personal feelings towards these 3 guys, I think saw them as kind of biting off more than they could chew, and people kind of wondering when ultimately the sand was going to run out. So that to me was really interesting. You get to behind the scenes of some of the movies that were made. Gladiator kind of famously has been I wouldn't say it was a cursed set because they ended up making the movie, and I think it's one of the better movies of the last 20 years. 20 plus years now, unfortunately. But Gladiator, you kind of get the behind the scenes of Gladiator, American Beauty, Saving Private Ryan. So you get some of the stories from these productions that were, important to the studio for various reasons. And so I thought that was really cool. I kind of like the inside and outside of business and how business dealings are happening and stuff. So I enjoyed all that kind of wheeling and dealing stuff. I enjoyed Katzenberg. In the history of Shrek, you get the whole history of Shrek back from when J.J. Abrams, the famous J.J. Abrams, I didn't realize this, was a member of a team of guys called the Propeller Heads who were really, really into CGI technology, basically almost at its beginnings. And so he was involved in this group for a little bit of time that eventually became some of the technology that Shrek was based on, which I thought was really cool. And so you get the story of Shrek, and you get the story of kind of Katzenberg trying to make the Prince of Egypt, and you kind of get all these stories. But ultimately, the story of DreamWorks is them running out of time and running out of money, and them not being able to coalesce and find their own way to kind of keep the wheels going. Spielberg especially, I think, creatively, Spielberg is kind of the king of almost everybody, I would say. And so I think that there's an underlining sense in the book that like Katzenberg and Geffen wished he had just made movies for their studio. But he had a clause where he basically could make whatever movies he wanted to. And because he's Steven Spielberg, they would just pay him tons of money. And even if DreamWorks was kind of some sort of attached to the picture, they didn't end up making a ton of money because Spielberg's fees and being co-produced with another studio basically ate into all their stuff. So it was almost like American Beauty was a pure DreamWorks movie, and I think they made, I don't know if it was between $15 and $50 million. It wasn't a ton of money that they made off that movie, but they made almost as much on that movie as they did from Saving Private Ryan in terms of the studio. Spielberg made a ton of money, Tom Hanks made a ton of money, but the studios themselves made about the same, the studio itself made about the same amount of money between those two movies, which is crazy. But that gets into the financing of all these things and how these things work, how scripts are approved, how Spielberg had a married couple that worked for him who basically ran the live action and had very specific tastes. And so when Katzenberg and Geffen tried to bring in other people to have more of a slate of movies, because one of the reasons that kind of the studio died was it just didn't put enough things into production quickly enough, because they had kind of these tastemakers who were gatekeepers of the stuff. It was all really interesting. I was interested in all of that stuff. I found it a look, especially at a time where I know a lot of these movies and know a lot of Hollywood and how at that point it's kind of transitioning slowly into the superhero and sequel mania that we have today really began during that time. So kind of watching all those things I thought was really interesting. As far as the cons go, the book is relatively long, and there's a lot, I would say, on the horse race aspect of the Oscar campaigns that probably could have been cut because I didn't find it particularly interesting. So I'd say there's probably a good 10-20% of the book that's about the Oscar horse races of, I'm trying to think of what beat out, Shakespeare in Love versus Saving Private Ryan, and there was a movie that was against American Beauty from Miramax as well that I don't remember. But you get the Harvey Weinstein of it all, of them being in a competition with DreamWorks over who would win the Best Picture Oscar, and you get kind of the 4-year consideration campaigns, and you get more of that stuff. That to me wasn't as appealing. I think you could have probably cut that if you were trying to trim, and the book is a little long. But if you're interested in this topic, I don't know if you're ever going to get something this thorough again. I will say, and she does say at the beginning that, she wasn't able to get access to Katzenberg, Geffen, or Spielberg for this, but she was able to source from hundreds and hundreds of other people. And so there's always to be some degree of separation from what actually happened and what she was able to report happened. But I think this is pretty much as good of a story of this period of time as you're going to get. To the best of my knowledge, these guys are all still friends today, and there is some acrimony, I think, towards the end of it. But I think that Spielberg was able to work with Katzenberg, at least lend his name to some project on Quibi, so I think that they're okay. I don't know where Geffen is in all this. I think if there's one person who's kind of an enigmatic figure, it's David Geffen. You don't really get the full understanding of what he's doing. His main thing, or one of the things he was able to lend his name to, was Geffen Records. Geffen Records, in this case, he had sold Geffen Records earlier, and he had created Dreamworks Records, which was a record studio inside the Dreamworks framework. And they actually were an interesting story because they were probably the closest thing to an artist-friendly record label that they had in the early 2000s. And they got a lot of props from the music community for putting out solid records from bands who didn't maybe sell a ton of records. You know, and the Eels were on that label, and Henry Rollins' band was on the label, and Nelly Furtado was on the label, but it was never a label, Elliott Smith. It was never a label that cranked out a ton of material and did a ton of business. And Geffen was still able to turn around and sell the record label for $100 million. And so I think at worst, he probably broke even on the record label. So if there was like one person who got closest to that ideal, it was probably David Geffen, because he came in, schmoozed a little bit, got Dreamgirls made, which I think he had a lifetime project of wanting to do, and also had run this record label, was able to be pretty hands-off on it, but still have a really high mark of quality considering the bands that were being put out. So I thought that was really interesting. The other interesting story I'll leave you with, there's a story about American Beauty of Sam Mendes directing his first movie, and Spielberg basically taking him in and saying, I know this is your first movie, but let me give you some of that Spielberg magic. And he basically sits Sam Mendes down and gives him a masterclass in directing. And I thought was one of the more warmer parts of the book. And I think those two have gone on. I think Amblin was a producer on 1917, if I'm not mistaken. So they continue to have a relationship. So you do see Steven Spielberg at kind of his worst and his best in this book, which I thought was pretty cool. And him being able to continue to be really a touchstone for a lot of filmmakers even to this day. So The Men Who Would Be King, you're either going to be interested in it or you're not. But if you are interested in it, I would definitely recommend checking out, because I think it's executed very well. Other than, like I said, there are some parts where, for me, the Oscar race stuff wasn't super interesting, but there are other people who may feel differently. So that was maybe the part that dragged the most for me, but otherwise I thought it was pretty good. Next time I'm going to be reading Save the Cat Writes a Novel. Until next time, please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Until next time, bye.